Hello, and welcome to another episode of 21 Minutes in the Past with me, Isaac, as your host. Today we are diving into one of the most dramatic political transformations of the 20th century, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. In just over a year, a powerful, modernising monarchy that had ruled for decades collapsed almost overnight, replaced by a new Islamic republic led by Ayatollah Khomeini. This revolution wasn't driven by just one group. It brought together students, workers, religious leaders, intellectuals, and everyday Iranians who are united by frustration with the Shah's autocratic rule, economic struggles, Western interference, and political repression. Today I am joined by
Ibrahim,
Jacob,
Edward,
Saul,
Hashim,
Kingsley,
Leo,
Iman.
Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. So, shall we begin? The first question we have for today is, why did opposition to the Shah, which had been consistent for a period, only turn into a successful mass revolution in 1978 to 79? Does anybody want to start off with that? Yes, Kingsley.
Well, I suppose it's a fairly kind of standard tale throughout history, if we think about what causes revolution often. Here, whilst there was, of course, as Isaac mentioned, opposition to the Shah previously, the economic downturn that preceded the Iranian Revolution of 1979 is a marked factor. So the Iranian economy was very much reliant on oil at this time, and there was an oil boom in the early 70s. For example, the oil revenue in their economy went from $2.4 billion in 1973 to 18.5 in 1974. But the bubble burst in 75, which meant that a lot of the spending that the Shah had placed in because of oil in the military, for example, was kind of gone. Like, it didn't have the same amount of revenue for the Iranian people, and that led to lots of political extremism. So you had, for example, the communist Tudeh party, as well as the Islamic extremists, as Isaac noted, and there was a lot of inequality as a result of that economic crisis, and really that kind of pushed Iranians who were already sick of the Shah's repression through organisations like the Savak, who were the domestic intelligence service. It pushed them over the edge, and I think that's a trend that we can note throughout much of history and revolutions.
To build off what Kingsley said, particularly in light of the economic troubles of the 1970s, with the economic modernisation that was occurring under the Shah, there is a notable amount of backlash that should be noted. With traditional social structures obviously being disrupted, but also there was a mass creation of inequality, with all of that wealth created, the 18 billion, obviously not going equally about. And also it did notably alienate a lot of rural and religious communities, which would form a lot of the backbone of the communities and groups which would then come to crucially oppose the Shah.
Yeah, just to add on both of those points, especially around the economics. I mean, 1970s is, globally for it all, was quite a dramatic time period. Especially the Iranians had really a good chunk of their oil was independent, with good relationships with the Americans, and the Americans and Britain as well during this period have horrible relationships with oil, as OPEC starts to become a much bigger player in the global oil economy, as numerous other Middle Eastern states start to take more agency over their own oil. And then additionally to Leo's point about the social factors, is that as the article we all read clearly said, Iran went into the 20th century on an ox cart. The enormous amount of, this is 1970s, we are in the West, post-sexual revolution of the 1960s. Iran was still, like many other Middle Eastern states, in a arguably pre-World War I type of social setting. I mean, so effectively you had in the 1970s two sexual revolution happening in a decade.
I mean, but we've heard a lot about the economics of the situation. What do we think about the actual position of the Shah himself in his declining health and the instability and indecision that comes with that? Do we think that that is also a decisive factor in why the revolution happens in 78 and 79? Yes, Kingsley.
To answer that question, it's incredibly important to talk about the political system within Iran. So the Shah was essentially an imperial appointment in the first place after World War I, and they did have a theoretically functioning parliament, which was the Majlis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm almost certainly not, and I apologise to any of our Iranian listeners, should there be any. However, there were prime ministers from this body, like well, people like Mohammad Mossadegh most famously, but they didn't really have any kind of significant role in the country's political processes. And they only had a 2-year period, meaning it was very difficult to create any meaningful change and impact on the Iranian political system. This meant that, to a large extent, the Iranian political system was a process of centralized power for the Shah. I nearly called him the Tsar there. Well, I suppose it's prescient, isn't it, with regards to they being deposed. But what that means is when the Shah is, because of course the Shah is a human, when the Shah begins to deteriorate mentally, the entire political system, because of how much it rests upon him, will do the same thing, as we can really see here, because the Shah really the Shah wanted to have his own kind of power, and we can see that in how there were so many, there were 12 prime ministers of the Majlis between 1941 and 1953, and 17 cabinets formed, which just shows how when the Shah wants to get rid of these people, he does, because he wants centralized power. So yeah, I'd say it has a lot to do with the political system in Iran as well.
But I think also it's actually the clash between the political system and the social system that you have a very, a monarchy, which even by the 70s is already most of us from our Western papers see as beacon of conservatism in the sense of maintaining social order, and you're challenging that with the more liberalizing parts of Iranian society at this point, especially from the secular wing of Iran. That's innate. Most secular societies do struggle at least to have any sort of like a dictatorship in the most obvious sense as you do have it in Iran, and so there's that conflict between the secular sides that allows for the religious sides who are outside the accepted society to work on those weaknesses.
Building on that point and moving on to our second question, to what extent do we think was the Iranian Revolution a religious revolution rather than a political or social one? We obviously know the final end result, which is the Islamic Republic, but in its origins, is the revolution Islamic?
I think Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, in his kind of first stages of the, I suppose, the campaign against the Shah, he was campaigning on the idea of an Islamic state, but I don't think his ambitions were always clear from a political or social point of view. I think he almost figured it out as he went along to an extent, because this is something that he hadn't had an experience in before, obviously. So I think, in answer to that question, I think that religion was a common theme, but it was never an explicit aim to establish a kind of a religious autocracy. So I think his ambitions evolved as he grew more influential.
I mean, I think if you look at Iranian history beforehand, the religious element has always been extremely symbolic. Beforehand you had the banning of the hijab. That's a major symbolic, and if you look at modern day, it remains that. I think there was significant political influences. You have the communists as well as the National Front, of course. They sort of fade away with younger voters, would-be voters if they could succeed. But I think if you look at it, he had to sort of utilize that political and social problems, and with the economic situation, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, and then thrust that into a religious issue. So he's able to sort of coalesce this anti-Shah idea into a pro-religious stance, and he's able to do that because of how the Shah utilized secularism.
Yeah, it's a good point you raised there, Ibrahim, and I'm kind of making an even broader one here, which is that, many sociologists and philosophers of the 20th century, like, for example, to name one, Charles Taylor, would argue that, to some extent, fundamentalism is a response to modernity and to secularism. Now, as a result of the Shah and his, for example, the White Revolution, which was very much in favour of implementing modernism within Iran, we'll probably discuss that in greater detail later. But the secularist efforts and them being, and the Shah sort of being a figurehead for those, meant that the anger towards secularism that came from religion was kind of, it manifested itself in fundamentalism that was directed against modernity, against secularism.
Do you think that the Iranian society at the time is incompatible with the modernism that the Shah was proposing?
I don't think that society as a whole was incompatible with the changes that the Shah was proposing. The thing I'm trying to say is that, to some extent, when religious institutions in a country feel threatened by secularism and modernity, oftentimes we can see a trend with this, for example, like in Afghanistan. When they feel threatened by secularism and modernity, they become more fundamentalist. And that's, I think, a trend that we see in Iran. Like, with regards to the idea of economics driving revolution and secularism driving religious fundamentalism, I'd say that to some extent the Iranian Revolution is not kind of surprising. I don't know if I'm trying to be too deterministic here about history, but it doesn't seem that all surprising to me with hindsight.
But I think as well, whilst alighting heavily on the Ayatollah's religious side, as we absolutely should, there is an undeniable nationalistic side to the revolution that can't be completely discarded. And it in fact went hand in hand with the religious sort of side that was being pushed by Khomeini, because obviously there was a blend of Shia Islam with Iranian identity itself, which became true national sovereignty, required this Islamic government, which Ibrahim earlier alluded to. But also within multiple of the groups, it wasn't just Ayatollah Khomeini, although he would later come out on end. There were numerous groups on the National Front remnants, there was some Marxist organisation, and I think it is also important to realise that nationalism itself, not just religious fundamentalism, played a massive part and went in fact hand in hand with this very decisive factor.
Yeah, I think what ultimately I think we're catching up on is it's the ability of the revolution to combine all the factors, I think, of economic strife, of nationalism and religion all going all together. I think you have the years of economic problems didn't just affect rural areas. It was throughout Iran. You had petrol, queues outside petrols, even within key areas of Tehran. But it's that, but then combining that with religious factors, in that Iran would then start to define itself to its two factors, its ancient Persian history, but then actually bringing that Shia Islam as it, what differentiates it from the rest of the Middle East. Nationalism is often about differentiating yourself from others, and just that ability of Ayatollah Khomeini to pull those factors together, that meant the revolution had the energy to propel itself.
Speaking of Ayatollah Khomeini, how crucial do we think he was as an individual and as a leader? Was he leading the movement itself, or rather was he riding the wider wave of anti-Shah sentiment that was flowing through Iran at the time? Do we think that it was that the revolution could have been avoided without the Ayatollah and his participation in it?
I think his participation isn't as important as it turns out to be later. At the beginning of the revolution, he's riding a wave more than anything else. It starts in 1963 with the White Revolution, but even before that you have Mossadegh originally, and he builds on this idea. Him being sent out of Iran in a way helped build his campaign, but it wasn't really about that. He just ended up being a figurehead who led the campaign towards the end.
I mean, so you say he's a figurehead, but we also have to remember, obviously, the influence he has on the revolution and its the later forms of the state afterwards. I mean, his work, the guardianship of the jurist, becomes the blueprint for post-revolutionary Iran. So I think it's important we do also consider that. Kingsley, do you want to?
Well, yeah. So the thing I wanted to talk about was how the Ayatollah seems to be at the kind of head of a coalescing of, like Leo mentioned, a greater move for nationalism and independence, because a growing feeling within Iran was that the Shah was essentially an imperialist tool. I mean, if we think about how, when the Shah was against World War II and Britain and involving Iran on the side of Britain, he was simply deposed, and his son, who was more amenable to the British war effort, was put in charge, which clearly shows how much power Western influence had on the Shah. Now, if we think about how the different factions of anti-Shah sentiment united, and how, for example, the Tudeh, the Communist Party, despite viewing the religious revolutionaries as reactionary, still praised their revolutionary sentiment against the Shah, which shows how really Ayatollah Khomeini seems to be a kind of figure at the head of a united move which was against the Shah and seemed to want to get rid of him however way they could.
Yeah, well, I think that's really interesting. And to build on what Kingsley said, I think whilst not just a figurehead, Khomeini gave almost unifying view of what the revolution against the Shah could be. So whilst there were lots of different groups involved, for example, we've mentioned the communist parties previously, students, workers and bazaar merchants who organised various aspects of a revolt, such as the oil workers' strike in 1978. The Khomeini gave almost a unifying view of anti-Shah legitimacy. So he had religious authority that did cross class lines that often divided some of these groups rebelling against the Shah. I've done the same thing. And this independence created a simple, powerful message, and I think this could unite the diverse groups in their hatred of this previous ruling.
Speaking about what Kingsley said earlier, and obviously the influence of foreign powers, the next question is, what role did foreign powers play in both the rise and the fall of the Pahlavi states, and how does that affect how we view the revolution's legitimacy as Western individuals?
I think that the intervention on the side of the Shah by the US and the UK can actually be seen to boost the legitimacy of the revolutionary forces, as all the interventionism really served to do was erode national legitimacy and only reinforce this stereotype or this image of the Shah as a Western puppet, which is an interpretation which can find a lot of grounding in merit, because he really was joined at the hip to the Western oil interests and the Western oil companies. And as such, we can see that the role of the foreign powers in the fall of the Pahlavi state can be seen as one of largely legitimising the forces working against it, which does serve to shape our understanding and our views, as this can be seen as anti-imperialist action taken all the way in the 1970s, which is very interesting to note, actually.
Yeah, I think with a bit of a broader stroke, if you look at the wider Muslim world, what you start to see is that secularism and these monarchist governments get associated with imperialism and corruption. If you look at, for example, the Arab Spring, and that sort of tends itself to people then establishing religious authority as this more pure and respectable version of government. And then I think you see that in Iran as well. And that's what sort of helps the religious movement, the anti-imperialist movement. I mean, you see, I think Kingsley mentioned it before, the communist groups sort of first they attack Khomeini, or forgive my pronunciation, and then by 1970 they're praising his anti-imperialist stance. So I think the influence of the foreign powers becomes much more important, and it's sort of a major point which communists may be able to use to sort of connect with the masses, which the Shah, even though he views himself as this paternalistic figure, he's unable to do. So I think that's why it sort of makes itself a major factor.
I think when answering this question, we have to bring in Carter's presidency, and we have to personalise the duel of images between Carter and Khomeini, because it's, Carter staunchly stays on the Shah's side right up until the bitter end. I think it was might have been at the party in Persepolis or another such gathering where he was very much singing the Shah's praises, and then when it all goes wrong, he almost feels compelled when Khomeini's been rejected by Sullivan, by Morocco, by somewhere in Latin America, finally takes refuge in the United States. So I think it's very interesting to track that foreign influence regarding the revolution.
It's quite interesting to note actually how the Ayatollah was in exile, because you can certainly draw historical parallels to Vladimir Lenin, like he was exiled in Germany for a while as well. But also, I think the influence of foreign agents via oil is really, really important. So after 1953, when Mossadegh was deposed in the CIA and MI6-backed coup, the US and Britain and France took pretty much full control of Iranian oil supplies. So 54% was owned by British oil companies Shell and BP, and 40% was run by American oil companies, and 6% was run by French oil. Now this kind of triumvirate, so to speak, ran Iranian oil until 1979, and by which point they were producing 6 million barrels of oil a day, and they were selling to Western oil markets. And this really shows how the country was essentially being economically exploited by foreign powers. And this nationalistic response, as Leo talked about earlier, is very much linked to that, because when the Ayatollah took over after the Iranian Revolution, there was a nationalisation of oil, and whilst it led to them only exporting 1.5 million barrels per day, they still managed to take control of their own national resources, and that was to a large extent the kind of spirit behind it.
And our final question, which is mostly the reason actually for why we've chosen this topic for this week, in relation to the geopolitical events we are seeing, in what ways does the Iranian Revolution of '79 help us understand the dissent and protests in Iran at the moment, and what we're seeing in Iran in the present day?
I think one of the most important things to note is how broad the support for an anti-establishment sort of movement or protest has to be. Within the modern protests that we've seen major protests practically throughout the 2010s and beforehand and in the 2020s. But within our modern day protests, not to draw too much optimism to it, we see a more sort of broader broader opposition to the Shah, not localized to a certain group or a certain area, which the 1979 revolution obviously had with their broad anti-Shah sort of alignment. So I think one of the most important things for Iran specifically is it can't be confined to a single group or a single area, but it has to be a truly nationwide movement.
I think Leo makes a good point about it being against the Shah more than anything else, and a lot of it isn't based on this Islamic revolution kind of view. And now there's a lot of very heavily Islamic law which is in place in Iran, and lots of people don't like that. Indeed, in 2022, when we had the Women, Life and Freedom protest, which came out against that, the Iranian Revolution was forced to limit some of its reforms, in the sense that it started allowing women to not wear the veil, but they still had to have their head covered. Now, this again came out in 2026, but it also shows how important the economy is, where there's a significant depreciation in the economy now in Iran, as there was in the decade leading up to the Iranian Revolution in 1979.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that, Sol, because as we speak, the Iranian rial is now worth 0 of the euro. So well, not to joke actually, because it is a very serious matter. And I think actually the thing that we can use to draw parallels is the idea that the state in Iran is so repressive, and the mechanisms by which reform can combat the repressive nature of the state and the erosion of civil liberties is through violent overthrowing. Now, unfortunately, in the case of the Ayatollah and the Islamic Revolution, the tyranny was simply replaced with another, even arguably greater form of tyranny. In fact, no, indisputably greater form of tyranny via the Islamic Republic regime. And what it clearly shows us as kind of people who live in a Western liberal state is that the mechanisms for resisting state tyranny need to be through reform, through political reform, because if they aren't, then the only way to actually meaningfully change a system is through violence, and that has that's incredibly detrimental for the people of a country, for sure.
So, thank you all very much for listening, and thank you all very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed our latest episode of 21 Minutes in the Past, and you'll be tuning into our next episode in 2 weeks' time. So, thank you all very much.